Join us on our Discord, the Greater Mandala. For access, sign up to the Order of Fire's mailing list.
All right, this is Jack Donovan, and you are listening to or watching PH2T3R Pater, the Journal of Solar Culture. And I'm here with my co-host, C.B. Robertson, author of many fine books, and something of an expert on today's topic. We're starting today our 10-week series on Plato's Republic. And it seems like so foundational to so much Western discussion and just big ideas generally that we figured we'd spend some time with it. And I don't think we could not benefit from doing so. So we're going to go through, but we're going to use it as I was thinking about this today, and we're going to use it as a jumping off point for discussion as more than well, what did Plato mean by this exact line? I don't know. We don't need to sit and nerd about every single statement that everybody made, because quite frankly, some of them are tiresome. I was reading through this. I was listening to this on audiobook. Did 2 long dog walks, trying to get a tan, and I'm like, these are insufferable bastards. One of the things that we've come to with the Order of Fire, I think it's pretty funny, is that prior to this past year of studying this material, I would have thought just generally like Socrates is very well thought of as a philosopher and whatever. He's a big name, right? And now my opinion of Socrates is, my God, he's an unsufferable prick. Like totally insufferable. Like if you were having an argument with the bar, you'd be like, shut up, stop it. But I mean, the point I think of Socrates, and Plato is really using Socrates in this dialogue as a questioning figure. He asks all kinds of questions, but then, in fact, he's even accused. I had a line highlighted where he's asking all the questions. Someone's like, "You never give your own answer. You just keep asking questions," and
right.
That's kind of the point of him, is to like make other people think, and so that's kind of that makes him not less insufferable in the sense of he's as a literary device. As a man in real life, he would be punchable. But anyway, what were you gonna say?
Well, I mean, it's it is important, I think, that he was invited by these guys. There's clearly a desire for this kind of conversation, and if someone were to just come up to you on the side of the road, it'd be like Diogenes, and just like ask you pointed philosophical questions, you'd be like, please stop. Your comment about his unsufferability reminded me to sort of jump ahead a little bit, not to spoil too much of the plot, but there is a descent into the underworld at the very end of the myth of air, where we go down and see what the dead are up to in Hades. And it's just funny. You'll see memes jumping through social media from time to time of like, hell is listening to these 2 people doing a podcast for eternity or whatever. There's probably like maybe the 2nd or 3rd circle of hell down that's just being interrogated by Socrates the entire time, as he hoped to do with Odysseus and Achilles and these other poor dead people from the past. It could be a novel for someone to write, maybe.
Absolutely, yeah. Being interrogated by Socrates, it'd be insufferable
forever.
It'd be insufferable to read. But what about? And if this is the thing that you weren't actually talking about, but how about this? It's a lot of that. I mean, you meet these people online all the time. You're making a point that I'm jumping too far ahead into what I wanted to talk about, because I came up with some ideas. But let's start at the beginning. Do you want to set up the scene at all?
Sure. So Are you talking about the story itself, or
Yeah, just the opening story, like set up the scene. I could do.
Okay.
I actually did listen to Michael Sugar's. So he set it up as well. Went
Yes.
over the whole setup and whatever kind of went in more detail about what the
I
Piraeus means. But go ahead.
we lost a few great philosophers this year. We lost Dan Dennett a few weeks ago, but we also lost Michael Screw back in like I think January or February. He's just of this year, so it's a big loss. It's a fantastic lecture. I hate to speak ill of the dead. I really strongly disagree with his take on the characters of the story, but his introduction of the themes is excellent in terms of outlining the significance of the Catabani, that opening descent, talking about the symbolic relationship between all these different things. In book one, which I'll give an overview of in a second, you hear Cephalus being asked about what's it like being old? Can you still have sex? And sex is actually a metaphor, because the the desire for power that is associated with thumos in Greek times and to some degree even in modern times has a kind of sexual undertone to it. Or in that it is thought of as a libido like drive. The drive for power can be very much like the drive for sex. And so speaking to Cephalus about or I believe it was Sophocles who he was quoting, saying, "What's it like? Can you still not have sex?" And says, Cephalus speaking to Socrates, quoting Sophocles, says, "Peace. I'm very happy to be freed from that mad demonic master that was controlling me." And he's speaking of sexual desire, but Cephalus says, and old age with frees you from not just one mad master but perhaps many, which is a prelude to the subject they're about to talk about, which is it better to be powerful, and is it better to be unjust and to pursue power, or is it better to be just and pursue righteousness, essentially, whatever that even means, but we don't even know. So it's a very strange setup, to be arguing over the goodness of a thing they haven't identified fully. But the story, such as it is, begins with Socrates saying, "I went down to Piraeus with Donovan." And Piraeus is the kind of port village, except it isn't really a village. It's the port town of Athens. And so it's this place where there's always people coming and going. It's this very busy hub of trade and people exchanging information. It's a very, you can imagine it was probably very metropolitan culturally, and is sort of the beating heart of the Athenian democracy. So there's symbolism in the use of Piraeus as the sort of setting of the story. But he goes down to Piraeus to pray to the gods and to see a festival. And he's with Glaucon, who is Plato's brother. So Socrates and Glaucon, they go see this, they pray, and they're on their way back when they are arrested. They are stopped by a slave boy who is the servant of Polemarchus. Polemarchus being Cephalus' son. And he says, Polemarchus commands you to wait. It says you have to wait. You could potentially read some symbolism into being told that you need to wait, perhaps, in approaching this book. So they wait, and they're, Polemarchus and Adimantus and a few others arrive, and they're very clearly friends. You have this very funny, kind of playful back and forth where he says, "Oh, you looks like you're going back to the city." Socrates says, "Yes, I am." And they basically jokingly threaten, we're going to abduct you and take us to our party where you can drink and eat and have fun unless you think you can overpower us. And there's this there's just so many symbolic little lines in here where Socrates says, "But isn't there one other option? Could we persuade you to let us go?" And Adimantus or Polemarchus says, how will you persuade us if we refuse to listen? You know, the depths of symbolic meaning there are limitless. But
I like that one. Well, then know that we will refuse to listen is like what he says next. I'm like, that's one of my favorite parts of this. Really, like I feel like I could use that in real life. Feel free to convince me, but I will refuse to listen.
Which one could imagine many people might have wanted to say to Socrates in the time. But so they go back to this party, and they, Socrates. It's just a like men sitting around drinking, talking, having a hangout time, which was like the best possible time for the Greeks, and at least in that era. And Socrates ends up in a conversation with Cephalus, who's this old man, and they were talking like, how is being old? You're at the threshold of old age. Is it really as bad as some people say? And there's this conversation about aging where Cephalus says, there's all these old people, and you get this phrase, birds of a feather flock together, which is nice to see the origins. All these old people complaining about the shittiness of old age. It's just so terrible. Their family's bad to them. It's just a struggle. Their health's fading. And he's like, it really hasn't been that bad for me, though. And so old age must not be the cause if I am old and yet I am not suffering in the way that they're suffering. And he says the real cause is injustice, essentially, and character. It's like these people have lived a poor lifestyle, essentially, such that when they reach old age, it has kind of caught up to them. And Socrates says, well, I love that answer, but I bet people don't believe you very much. And they say, because you're wealthy. And he says, well, yes, being wealthy is nice, I'm not going to lie, but not for the reason that these people imagine it is. And then they say the utility of wealth is being able to pay your debts and to not be basically frees you from the temptation to theft and immorality of that kind. Which is not normally the way we think of wealth today. Normally think of wealth.
I mean, it is though. I mean, like as I was briefly saying, before the show, we were talking about money a little bit. And, like, when do you get stressed about money is when you have debts. It's like, oh, your credit card bill is way higher than it should be. And, like, you owe money and you have payments and all this shit. That's when money, that becomes very not fun and very stressful. And so it actually is very, like, the best. That's true. The best thing about having money is, like, and I said, like, the year that I was doing the best, I'm like, I just didn't worry about things. Like, there's money in the bag, just like worry, like, if I want to buy something, I'm gonna buy it. Money isn't a worry. And right. I think that's very much the same. I mean,
which is one of the things that Socrates points out. He says, Cephalus, you act like someone who inherited your wealth rather than someone who made your wealth, because you treat it with kind of indifference, whereas the people who have made their wealth treat their money as like a second love, like their own child, and so they're just awful company because they can't talk about anything else. Which is
I love that you have this almost verbatim. I mean, because I've listened to this twice today. You're like pretty much like your memory has the exact lines almost. Yeah, it's like a child or a poem, basically, is what he says in this part. Is just because, and I actually reposted that line to Twitter because there's so many guys on money Twitter that's all they talk about is money, and it's like the people who are money makers. It's like a child, like it's a child or a poem or a piece of art to them, and they're insufferable because they just talk about money all the time.
Right. Yeah. Now imagine if perhaps, as there might have been some thematic or symbolic crossover between sex and power, if there might be some perhaps crossover between money and power as well, at least in the acquisition, because we're about to run into a sophist whose job was to teach people how to speak in such a way as to acquire and maintain power. So the conversation about justice and the importance of justice led Socrates to ask Cephalus, what is justice? because surely it can't be. And he asked this tricky question about what if, suppose, you borrowed a weapon from a man, but when he was not in his right mind, he requested his weapon back. Surely it wouldn't be just to give his weapon back if he was not in his right mind. And the symbolic foreshadowing of people who are not in their right mind can go into all kinds of places that get touched on later as well. And this becomes this kind of problem that leads to the conversation about, well, what is justice after all? And Cephalus, this is where I disagree with Michael Segru. Michael Segru says Cephalus was a very unjust man who is belatedly trying to atone his way out of his unjust life with the sacrifices and stuff. And I'm like, when the young men start arguing about justice, it says he turns with a laugh and walks away.
Yeah,
like very happily, gleefully, like, okay, they'll carry on the conversation. Excellent. Where my boy is being educated, kind of vibe to it. So I disagree with Michael Segru on that and on his characterizations of most of the other characters as well. But there's this repeated language of inheriting the argument, which is so many levels of meta, it's not even funny, because here we are talking about these arguments that we've inherited from Plato himself, and they've of course inherited them from other people, and we see some foreshadowing of very common philosophical terms, even just in book one. We see it elsewhere. We see basically the first example that I know of anyways of what you might call an ontological argument. You see a very funny example of what we have come to call a reductio ad absurdum, where after Polemarchus jumps in and starts talking about, well, justice is the repayment of debts, and Socrates twists him up with his language into saying, well, that means after this and this and this, and if we accept this, that justice means harming people who have done no wrong. And Polemarchus is like, that seems like a bad argument, and he can't explain why. And Socrates says, oh, so then you would say we should do good to the just and harm to the unjust. And he says, that sounds better to me. And it's what you have there is a reductio ad absurdum argument in its form. And basically the entire mechanism by which this dialogue is to take place is laid out in book one, which is this hunt for internal consistency from initial axioms. And it's very important to remember that as people get further into the dialogue, and like to keep going back to book one, because people in this dialogue have no fear whatsoever of saying absolutely absurd things, going the full distance in these arguments, so long as they are consistent with their axioms, or we get into some fascist communist abolition of the family and private property and eugenics and all kinds of crazy stuff later on. And there's a whole host of serious people who believe that Socrates is being literal, that Plato is being literal when he advocates these things. And we have at the beginning, just in book one, this setup of the purpose of this conversation. And my favorite example, because it's so simple and it keeps this lighthearted tone, is where he convinces Polemarchus of a new concept of justice, where he says, that means justice means doing harm to nobody, not even one's enemies. Polemarchus says, yes, that's right. The just man doesn't harm anybody, because a just man makes other people more just and improves them. And so the just man doesn't harm anybody. And Socrates is like, yes, excellent. And so you'll take up arms with me against anybody who disagrees with this notion. It's like, taking up arms in order to not harm people. Like, it's on its face, it's an absurd kind of playful contradiction. And I think Michael Segru points out, it feels as if Socrates is intentionally making bad arguments. He's intentionally trying to draw Glaucon and Adimantus, who have not spoken up yet into to draw them into this conversation that is really between Socrates and the sophist named Thrasymachus, who argues that justice is nothing but the advantage of the stronger. And that's the majority of the first book.
Right. And it's there's a lot to unpack, obviously there, and the idea, the joke about taking up arms to make everyone peaceful is very common. I mean, obviously, you're saying used absurdly here, but I mean that is 90% of what you see online. I mean, it's kind of the basic theme of my whole violence is golden thing. Like, do you understand what you're saying when you say that when you make a law, it says that you're going to do violence against someone who breaks the law?
Right.
There's no way around that. And and if everybody just puts down their arms, the first one who picks them up wins. Like, it's like, and so it's just fascinating to see that broken out. But some of the observations that I had going through it were one is the topic of what is justice as they're presenting it too broad, because there's two different discussions almost going on there, or maybe not, but there's a discussion about management and conflict resolution that has to do with leadership. Like in leadership and positions of power, a lot of what you're doing is management and conflict resolution. You're negotiating things, right?
Right.
And that's, whether you're just is to, if people say you're just or unjust. And then there's more of like how you're living your everyday life, which might have some of that involved, but it's a little bit more of a different vibe. So it's so living your life well, maybe you get into a point where integrity is probably better than justice, or at least in the way that we understand the word justice at all. You're talking about more like living with integrity, which I always say, and I just like posted this on X today as a response actually to your boy Scott Adams. I think I got first comment in. I'm like, that's always good because you mean everyone sees it. And because Scott Adams reposted, Elon Musk decided to reinstate Nick Fuentes.
Oh,
because it's free speech, and Scott Adams was like an expensive but principled decision, and I jumped in with the first comment of integrity is always expensive.
It is
because it is. Integrity in many ways is similar to justice in this thing, but integrity has to move more with yourself and your everyday life and your own internal consistency.
Yeah, isn't it nice? Yeah. Isn't it nice to be as wealthy as Elon Musk, such that you can afford to have integrity?
For sure.
Isn't that like the Cephalus would I think point and be like, it's not bad to be wealthy when it allows you to be just in that way. Well,
that's what they call fuck you money.
Right.
I mean, he has the most fuck you money. You can say fuck you to the most people and do exactly what you think is right, or just do what you want. But if you're trying to be a good person, if you're trying to be just or have integrity, you can do that without having to compromise yourself that much.
Right.
Whereas I say to everyone else,
or like Socrates and try to have integrity, it might not work out so well.
Yeah. I mean, I always say to guys, being like, do you need to make a living? Because there's only, as I've said to many people over the years, including a fellow who wrote a book, Find Your Hill. It's, you have to pick your hill and not fight all the battles going in every direction.
Right.
What is important to you that you want to talk about in life? Because every injustice and every lie and every thing that you want to expose all around, if you do that from every angle, you actually just created a circle of enemies all around you. And a poor man can't do that. Like, hey, you know, like if you're Elon Musk, you can have enemies all around you because you can throw lawyers at them.
Right.
But you know, a regular guy, I mean, like, okay, well, what do you want to talk about for the rest of your life? And there are certain things that if you talk about them, like that is the only thing you'll ever be able to talk about again.
Right. And it's a utilitarian point, and it's a funny one to talk about because, you know, in book 1, and this is really expanded upon in book 2, very, very thoroughly by Glaucon and Adeimantus together, is it can be very disadvantageous to be good, to be just, to have integrity in this way. And conversely, it can be very, very advantageous to take the ticket and sell your soul. And to basically take the NPC position on anything.
Yeah.
Which is the path of least resistance. And so when we'll see this in book 2, I don't want to jump too far ahead because there's a lot to talk about with that. But
For sure.
What Thrasymachus argues is less of a utilitarian point and more of a psychological point. He's almost like a proto-Nietzschean in a way. And this is also where I disagree profoundly with Michael Segru. He says that Nietzsche was deeply envious of Plato, and he just stole all his ideas from Plato. It's like, that's not what's happening. That's not Nietzsche's will to power. But what you have in Thrasymachus is this sort of psychological argument that people defend. If everybody had the skill, they would, if people had the skill, they would be tyrants. And it is best to be tyrant because being a tyrant gives you advantage. You can date and marry who you want. You can do what you like. You can take money from other people and use it for your own interests. It puts you in a superior position. People defend justice out of kind of a position of ressentiment. And they say it's a he doesn't use that language, obviously, but you know, everyone who could be unjust would be. But people who defend justice are kind of naive fools. At one point, Socrates says, "Do you think the unjust man is moral?" Or I forget his word. I think something like moral. And Thrasymachus says, "Yes, yeah, it's you know, excellent. It's virtuous to be unjust." He says, "So you think it is unvirtuous or a vice to be moral?" And he says, "No, being just isn't a vice. It's more of divine simplicity." So like what we would say is naivete. It's you don't understand the world. And there's a conversation about sheep and why do shepherds keep sheep as well, where he says, you know, "Socrates, you're saying the art of shepherding is about the interest of the sheep, but that's not why shepherds keep sheep. You know, shepherds keep sheep to eat them, fleece them, or there's a third F that gets sometimes jokingly thrown in for fun. But like, you know, it's not for the interest of the sheep, you know." And then Socrates says, you know, "Oh, but you meant these things in the strict sense. You were talking about, you know, ruling in the most technical sense of the term. And insofar as shepherding is an art that is not the same as money making or cookery, the art of shepherding in the strict sense actually is definitionally about the interest of the sheep." And he basically, this is the origin, essentially, sort of early shadow of what will come to be ontological arguments in philosophy, which are arguments about the essential, necessary nature of a thing based upon what it means to be that thing. This is most commonly made of God in Christian circles, but there's an interesting argument, ontological argument, that René Descartes made with triangles, where he says we can know ontologically that the interior angles of a triangle all add up to 180 degrees, which is not a part of the definition of a triangle. A triangle is just 3 points in space. but from its nature alone, without doing any empirical testing, we can know from the definition of what a triangle is, what it must be, we can deduce something else that must be true about triangles that is not just a part of their definition. And a lot of what we're seeing in book 1 is not just this sort of pre-ontological argument style, but kind of the silliness of those kinds of arguments and the slipperiness of equivocation. And we'll see how nobody is really persuaded by this in book 2.
Yeah. Thrasymachus's argument, taken at, I mean, obviously, you can go full might is right with it, but which is kind of what it is. And to a certain extent, you can also say it as a knowing perspective of how the world actually works. Aside from how we would like things to be, like, okay, we would like everyone to be like, every ruler should be George Washington, but who also pissed off a lot of people. He put down a whiskey rebellion or whatever. Like he was not everyone loved him, but in my perfect world, all rulers would be George Washington. They don't actually want power, and that's kind of what they're talking about a little bit. Like the ruler who doesn't want power, but it just does it. Like that's why they pay him. I think was what the discussion. They pay him because it's a burden almost to do that job.
Yes. Yeah. We that gets it built up even more when they talk about the ascetic philosopher kings who don't own money, and they're basically forced to do this job that they wouldn't want to do.
Right.
There's a related passage. This book opens with I went down, kata bene, this descent. Right. In Thus Spake Zarathustra, you have a similar opening, which is an appeal to this as well. I love the man who goes down. Zarathustra was up on the mountain for a decade, but he chose to go down among the people because he had just this overflowing abundance of energy and wisdom to share. And, Socrates, there's this depiction that the philosopher who comes to understand the truth, why would he want to, go down to the Piraeus? Why would he want to descend into the domain of mortals and their democratic silliness, where they'll arrest him and demand that he come to their party in a profoundly unphilosophical fashion, an anti-philosophical fashion. In fact, we will refuse to listen to you until you come over here. There's a lot of nested and crossing lines, symbolically tying everything together. But the connection between Nietzsche's Descending Zarathustra and Plato's Descending Socrates is there as well.
Well, jumping back to Thrasymachus' argument, he just so people, he's basically talking about, like people, what we know to be true, which is that what is just is actually determined by people with power. In 90% of the cases, in America, we're spoiled that spoiled that with the First Amendment that you can say what you want to power, and say that power is unjust. But in a monarchy, that is the king does things from God.
Yeah.
he's given the power of God to make right decisions, and his decisions are right because they come from God. And the same for the Pope. The Pope speaks from the chair, ex cathedra, like he speaks from God, and the people with power generally get to determine what is good. And if you really aren't allowed to say that they're wrong. In many cases, like this is what we believe is right, and this is what we're gonna go with. Right. My actions are right because I have chosen them. Which is Nietzsche would kind of applaud that. Like that's what the master morality is. Like, of course, my actions are right because I have chosen them. And obviously the criticism of that Socrates gets into is like, well, they can make mistakes, but that doesn't. I think that that's like a disingenuous argument, because in the sense of what he's actually saying is that, well, they'll legislate what justice
Well,
is. You know, they have the spin.
This is the problem with equivocation is, they're using these words in different senses, which is funny because it's exactly what Thrasymachus accuses Socrates of when he says, but justice is the interest of the stronger. Now, why don't you applaud me? But of course you won't. And Socrates says, now hang on. When you say the interest of the stronger, do you mean justice is eating meat like the wrestler over there, because eating meat makes him stronger? And he says immediately is this, Socrates, you you take the words in the sense that is most damaging to the argument, which you could underline as another like philosophical origin to the identification of equivocation, which we see a lot of in book one. And one has to wonder, like, you have to remind yourself, because things take a different tone later, that like Plato knew what he was doing when he makes Socrates so obnoxiously wrong and philosophically kind of reckless in this way, and making, as he was accused of doing 20 years earlier, the worse seem better and the better seem worse. It's the Thrasymachus. Sorry, I sort of lost track of where we were. We were talking about the equivocation. Thrasymachus is arguing that justice is like, this is how the world works.
Right, and he's not wrong.
Whereas Socrates is making kind of a normative argument of this is, no, that's not quite true either. He's not just saying how things should be. He's saying, he's not necessarily disagreeing that is how the world works, but he's saying that the people who achieve all this material wealth are in fact unhappy and are doing bad. Not just
Which sounds like a poor man's argument.
It does sound like a poor man's argument. Yes,
that says a lot. Are all rich, wealthy people unhappy? Is Elon Musk unhappier than someone who can't pay their bills?
So
I don't know.
This goes back to the conversation with Cephalus when he asked Cephalus, what's it like? Can you still have sex? And he quotes Sophocles. Sophocles also has a tie-in with the conversation we were having before about justice. Sophocles' most famous play, Antigone, has a lot to say about is justice just the word of the king, or is there something higher? But a tangent. Cephalus is quoting Sophocles and speaking for himself, saying it's nice to have money, but this sexual drive to acquire more is actually very unpleasant. It can make you feel crazy. And there was an interview with Andrew Tate, of all people. I think I might have mentioned this before, where this psychiatrist...
Who would absolutely agree with Thrasymachus.
Well, kind of. So the psychiatrist...
I think if he was honest and alone in a room, he absolutely would.
well, he says that directly to his audience, like every day. But the psychiatrist asked him, "Are you envious of anybody?"
Right. Yeah, we talked about this.
Yeah, and what he said was actually very in line with Cephalus's answer, which is like, I actually envy the man who is free from these desires. I envy the man who genuinely doesn't want. And he throws in the Thrasymachus point. He says 99% of the guys who say they don't have these desires are lying. They say they don't as sour grapes, Yes. He said there are some guys who genuinely don't want that, who are indifferent to it. And he said he's envious of those guys. So there's a, in my opinion, Tate is still, he's not to Socrates or Cephalus level of wisdom, but he's been around. He knows the world a little bit, and it's interesting to see him sort of take both sides in a way. He's definitely broadly a Thrasymachus type character, but he definitely is saying like it's not actually that pleasant necessarily. Everyone wants this, it's good to have, but even better is the man who doesn't want these things, which is a strange thing to hear from someone like Tate.
Yeah. I mean, it's vaguely like Buddhist-ish, like freedom from attachments and desires, like that, which is how that struck me actually in the discussion when they brought it up. I'm like, oh, that's a little bit of a anti-life, anti-worldliness kind of thing. But because is it bad to want things? I don't really think so. I think to want things is like the most natural, most human thing in the world. Like now, if you're just consumed by it and that's all you care about, but then those are some of the time those are the people who get it sometimes.
Right.
As the people who love making wealth, they're the ones who get it. Like they want it, and that's what they're focused on. They go get it. Same as if you really wanted to do anything. Like if I want to do something, if I want to accomplish something. It comes at the expense of other things, and you just that's what you've chosen, and that's, I think, good. That's being alive. It's making choices and going after things. So
right.
But so before we go any further, first, do we have any questions or comments?
We have Juan Midden saying, "Love you, brothers. This is important work." McTubis much earlier said, "Just like a philosopher, to only be able to talk about sex in the abstract."
Now, he actually jumped in on my X feed because I asked X, like, what is justice? And on X, okay, here I got it now. This is the funny little exchange we had. He said, "Justice is conformity to the lowest common denominator." and I just replied, "Thrasymachus, that you?" He posted a meme response of Walter White going, "You got me." So that was an interesting response. And then I got a guy who replied, "My heart knows only revenge." And then it's interesting to see people work through this. We have somebody responded, "Depending on the context, it might mean the impartial rebalancing through law of relationships between individuals, groups, communities, or society after the occurrence of wrong or wrongs." And that's why I said I feel like there's a different. If we're talking about legal justice,
right,
it's very much about conflict resolution. And that's a different, I think a different thing from integrity. What is legal justice has to do with resolving things in a way that is agreeable.
Well, and this goes back to the Descending Odin's Throne essay in Pater, because the word that Plato is using. You brought this up in our chat earlier. Was it yesterday or today? Well, the Greek word that Plato is using for justice is, I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, but dikaiosune, or dikaiosine, which is a conjugation or an etymological cousin of dike, which is an ancient word for justice that comes from the root of direct or straightforward. You see this in like the end of the shield depiction in Homer's Iliad, where there's an argument over a blood price, and the judges are sitting around, and gold will be given to the man who can give the straightest answer, the straightest verdict. DK, that's justice. So there's this connotation of DK and straightforwardness, but that comes from a time where justice was vengeance, just directly. And this is what Nietzsche brings up in the tarantulas. Their word justice is the desire for vengeance, and obviously Nietzsche's saying justice is vengeance, so just ditch justice. He's not taking the Platonic route of saying no, justice is good. He's saying no, justice is just vengeance, and also vengeance is bad, so justice is bad. Whereas what we're seeing in the Republic is post Aeschylus. It's after Aeschylus, after justice has been transformed into something else. So what did it get transformed into exactly? Well, let's explore that, says, the interlocutors in the dialogue.
Right. And we got another comment in, actually, because I made a post. I tried to throw this around to a whole bunch of places to see what we would get, because it's such an interesting question. And this was from a woman, actually, I posted to the YouTube community notes. And she said something about restorative justice. And then so I had to look up what that is, officially, like, for whatever. And on Wikipedia, and it's kind of hippy dippy in a sense, but it's like a sense of, like, rather than focusing on punishing crimes, not to say that is to make people make amends,
right,
for crimes, which that could be as hippy dippy as it wanted to, or as it could be like you cost us people, it'd be money, and at the end of the day, it's kind of like its own blood price.
Yes, and so the first time I heard of restorative justice was from Tamler Summers in his book Why Honor Matters. And he says restorative justice is a nice middle point. He says the problem with modern justice is you take away the intervention of the state inherently takes away the feeling of what's the right word? Compensation isn't even quite the right word, but it's close. I'll go with it. Like compensation for the wronged party. The intervention prevents the participation of the wronged party in the righting of the wrong. And so he advances restorative justice as we bring back a little bit of what was good in honor cultures from the past, but in a more controlled way. So maybe we can have the best of both. Now, I'm not sure whether I'm convinced or not that's actually how restorative justice plays out in practice, where it's been tested.
Who's doing the playing out.
Right.
Like, it's like, I mean, on a certain sense, it's kind of what you would do as a father, I guess.
Yeah.
Perfect example. Restorative justice. What my parents made me do, which I didn't really think was very fair, and I was didn't like it. But reason why I never learned how to skateboard is because the first time I ever tried, it was a bunch of kids. They let me use their skateboard. I'm not actually really good on things with wheels, to be honest. That's not like my best life. But I was trying it because all the kids in the neighborhood skateboard, whatever. And I was trying to skateboard, and I kicked it out from under me, and it went right under like a moving vehicle and it crushed the skateboard. Oh. Like, it was just driving through the neighborhood or whatever, but I kicked it out from me while a car, I fell off basically while the car was going by. It went under, skateboard got ruined. So my parents, in the name of restorative justice, made me go over to the parents' house of the kid who I broke their skateboard and offer to work to pay the debt to get a new skateboard, because it was like a new fancy, like, whatever, cool skateboard. Right. And that is a level of restorative justice that is probably correct. If you're a kid and you vandalize a building, and graffiti kids should have to fucking repaint the building.
There's a movie about that.
That's a perfect example.
Free Willy, which came out in like the 90s. It was about a kid that had got caught doing graffiti stuff and then had to work at the aquarium that he
okay, that's how it started. I'm like, it's about a whale, right? But yeah. Cool. But
I don't know how I remember that, but
it gets tricky when you get into like murder and all kinds of other things, or like SEC violations or whatever. Like
what you described is actually not restorative justice per se. That's what you described with the skateboard was honor culture. That was two people working it out. At a family level, in fact, our familial honor is like we pay our debts and stuff. Restorative justice would be like you break your friend's skateboard or wreck their car, or you kill their neighbor or something, and they take you to the court, and the court says, look, we find you guilty of, you wronged this person, but we're going to bring them in. And it's not the judge that's actually giving the sentence. The judge sets parameters, and then the wronged party actually gives the sentence and decides what the punishment should be to a degree.
Right.
And it's interesting that people are, when they are brought into the process, they're actually a lot less vindictive than you might imagine them to be.
Sure.
A lot of the vindictive feeling comes from the feeling of justice not being done. And so people get much more like, that person should be drawn and quartered, you know.
Right.
But when it's actually like, okay, this, you know, Joe wronged you personally. Here they are. Here you are. What do you think is an appropriate punishment? And by the way, this is the maximum and this is the minimum. We're not going to let you, you know, blood eagle someone because they, you know, killed your cat. You know, but like within the constraints, what do you think is appropriate? And what you end up with is not just a restoration of the balance, but often, not all the time, but sometimes even a kind of restoration of a relationship of some sorts. At least that's the hope. So you maintain, the state is still involved. It's still the facilitator, and the sort of guarantor, but it's bringing the people back in. So you're bringing the best parts of honor in. That's the idea, anyways. Again, there are criticisms of restorative justice from the right and the left, but it's cool and very interesting that someone brought that up as an idea.
Yeah. I mean, it definitely seems like an idea that could work for depending on the situation. Like, it is, like, I remember, like I said, when I got robbed in Salt Lake City, they involved me in the process and wanted me to, like, do you want to make a statement before this guy gets paroled or whatever, for credit card fraud or whatever, you know? So, and I was like, yeah, I don't really need to. That's nice that they asked, but you know, like, I'm like, I think, you know, whatever happened is fine. Yeah, I mean, you could see how you'd be a little bit more forgiving in that instance. Yeah, it has some merits for sure. It's not like a problem. Like I said, not good for everything, but it has some merits for sure. As a theme of our discussions in the Order of Fire and Solar Idealism, we've basically come around to we like human judgment better than like strict rules, systems, like like systems, like getting people to work shit out and people to make decisions is better than just people with wisdom and actual life experience to make decisions, which again kind of goes into who should rule and just what justice is, because you don't let Greta von Thunberg make fucking decisions because she's a retard and she's a kid. And has been a puppet for her whole life. But a grown man who's dealt with some highs and lows and seen some bullshit, and you know has a wide range of experience, then that's maybe a guy who can come in to like ask a question.
Well,
and
I think that's why.
Yeah.
I think that's why Nietzsche loved the Napoleons, the man who says this is just because I say it is. It's because it is embracing the inevitable judgment that is required, and yet that judgment is still making a system. He is making laws. The lawgiver is this sort of philosophical ideal of the giver of order in history, especially where laws are concerned, and those come from judgment, you know. It's inescapable, but it's a high level of judgment, and you know, but in order to do that, you have to think things through. And so, if there's any like solar value that can be gleaned right off the bat from this book one, and we're about to see a lot more of it over the next 9 books, is they're working through the consequences of certain ideas. And if you take a really legalistic, precise interpretation of a line, what follows from that? And that is the kind of thinking that you have to do when you are creating laws. Suppose you're going to create a city, like a republic. What do you have to think about? And like how are you going to phrase things? Are you going to say, justice is doing benefit to your friends and harm to your enemies? Or do you have to clarify and say, no, justice is doing harm to your enemies when they are bad and good to your friends when they are good, as was clarified by, I believe that was Polemarchus, some ways through being questioned by Socrates. That level of clarity it is important to work through these kinds of things if you are going to be an order giver in your environment.
Right. I mean, when one of the lessons I learned when I was in a certain tribal group early on, as a new leader in said group, I was told to think about precedent. Like everything you do has precedent, and that it was like if you break the rules for one person, then everybody else thinks that they can break the rules too, and so there's a certain balance between this is always the rule and, well, this is not, okay, this was a weird situation. Right. And so you have to like kind of feel that out, and you can, and really the way that you resolve that is that you have to make the argument public of why you made that decision. Like rather than like, this is why this is a good rule, but here's what happened. This is what I think is reasonable. And here, before I get into that, because I have a whole thing that goes from there, but let me see if we have any. Do we have anything else in the comments, just to make sure?
Alexander Paulson says an acknowledgement of theft as a universal bad underpins justice as a means to rectify that cosmic rule. Well, and I think Socrates might reply to that how absolute is that? Do you mean to say that theft is wrong even when the state collects taxes, or when an army invades a neighbor, or but we need our taxes to pay for the army that will invade the neighboring land so that we can have nice things. I'm jumping ahead in books here, but
for sure, it's all true. But yeah, I mean that's and the thing is, that actually brings up something a point I had written down about the scope of justice and the discussion of justice is that it's probably, if you're going to come to a definition of justice and understand a justice, it's at a tribal level, rather than the problem is when you get into universal justice, then you have that intertribal situation, like because or like you get into fucking libertarian bullshit where it's like the non-aggression
the NAP,
the NAP, because in reality that's the way humans have always worked, is that like, well, that tribe's weak and we want their shit, so is the tribe that does that always wrong? And in according to the NAP, then they would always be wrong, but also according to Thrasymachus, they would actually make that right.
Well, and Michael Segru brings up the character of Thrasymachus is in many ways an allusion to Thucydides and the Melian dialogue, where the Athenian Empire has expanded into the Melian territory, and they basically give the Melians an ultimatum, and they say, look, you have to join us and pay tribute yearly, and we might do some other things to you too, or we're going to wipe you out completely. And the Melians say, this is a pretty shitty thing to do to your neighbor. Aren't you worried about the precedent that's going to set to, everyone around us? You can't just come in here and invade us. This is clearly like wrong and stuff. And the Athenians say to the Melians, basically, look, the strong do as they will, and the meek endure what they must. That's like the takeaway line from the Melian dialogue from Thucydides. And the Melians end up saying, well, you're making a terrible mistake and we're not going to do with this. And the Athenians say, okay. And then they slaughter them. So that's how that played out. There's a kind of, in the same way that the people who are hearing the rhapsodes recite Homer already know the story of the Trojan War, one would imagine the people who were first reading Plato's Republic would be familiar with the Melian dialogue, would know like the allusions at work here. And there are were people who said the Athenians lost the Peloponnesian War, which came sometime after that, because they got too greedy and too ambitious. They couldn't even rein in their own lust for power and dominance. And the Melian situation was a sort of symptom of that worked out right then, but then they lost when they ran into Sparta. And we see some allusions to some very Spartan notions of what government should look like later on in the dialogue.
See also Hitler.
Sparta was inspirational to a lot of people. It was very inspirational to the founding fathers of the United States, many centuries before Hitler came to power.
Oh no, I just mean generally. It's funny that not Sparta specifically, but the
Athenian expansion. Yes,
the Athenian expansion. Like oh well, that worked out. It worked out for you in Poland, but if you would have stopped there, you could have held that for 100 years. But you can't. But you wanted everything.
You can't just keep on taking. Yeah,
you can't just keep on taking because eventually you're gonna blow up internally and just be overwhelmed. But same kind of thing, and it's like that always happens. Those big empires don't last very long because they eventually lose their momentum, and then they just start ceding the territory back. Right. Where is the Empire of England? They just gave it all back eventually because they just got tired of taking it and they couldn't control it anymore. But and also probably a lot of other reasons. But I want to throw in because. I want to do this more often and involve the guys in the first men, our main group in the Order of Fire, our kind of closed group, because I asked them to weigh in on this too. Well, what their thoughts on it. So and Bronson obviously has been around for a long time in a group. He just jumped in with on a universal scale, righteousness and cosmic order, and the answer to the question is what is justice? On a societal scale, it depends on the culture. As soon as you start talking about natural and moral laws, we all need to agree on that which laws exactly, which is where our brothers in Christ start to piss me off. And that's what we're saying. That's what I'm saying. Like,
yeah.
What?
It's a beautifully Homeric answer.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. And so it's, again, you run into, you can tribally actually probably come up with a much better, at least sense of justice than maybe you can in a universal sense. Right.
I mentioned Thucydides. Herodotus opens the histories with a funny dialogue where he's talking about, there's this people, some miles away across the ocean, who eat their dead. They're cannibals when they're not like eating enemies, but like when their father passes away, they eat him. And the Greeks heard this, and they're like, "That's horrible. Well, there's impious and blah blah blah." And he says, "Yeah, it sounds that way to me." And when I told them that the Greeks burn their dead, they had the same reaction. there's a funny and it's not a condemnation or a praise, but it's a sort of revelation of the customary nature of that particular example of justice. Now, as Alexander Paulson pointed out, some things do seem to be a little bit more universal. Like different cultures might have different notions of the proper way to dispose of the dead. There aren't really any cultures I'm aware of that say theft is fine. There are some maybe hunter-gatherer communist sort of or proto-communist hunter-gatherer.
I got one.
Do that.
Again, this is the tribal thing. Vikings. All they did was steal. They're a raiding culture. All these cultures are raiding cultures. I mean, the Comanches.
You're stealing from other people. You're not stealing from
exactly. That's the thing. It's a tribal sense, and this goes back to our discussion about human universals and that list. Is that the list pertains to the group itself, right. In the same way, it's a human universal that rape is wrong.
Right.
In your tribe. basically, like, within our people, we do not rape the women in our tribe. Like, that's a human universal. Every tribe everywhere is like, we do not rape. I mean, there are tribes there are people who are like, maybe look the other way more than they should. But, like, it is a human norm that we don't officially sanction rape within our group.
Right.
But a lot of these groups went around raping all kinds of people that are not in their group.
Now,
And you know, so
this is where the idea of the gods or natural law, I think, comes to play, because you know, it may not be illegal to go and, you know, break the law on outlaws, on people outside of the protection of the law, whether that's rape or theft or murder or, you know, whatever. But if you kill somebody and that other person has a family, regardless of the law, that family might have an opinion about it and want to do something to you about it, or to your family about it, you know. And this
which
is
is
where
actually all the Viking sagas. Is what they're about. Is that what happens with that? Yeah.
Interestingly enough, the Greek sagas as well, which was full of pirates and you know, bad things happening to the pirates doing pirate things, like Odysseus. So
live like a pirate, die like a pirate.
Yeah, yes. Or almost die like a pirate, get delayed like a pirate. So there's you know, what we're seeing, without doing too much plot spoiling with the Republic, is a conception of justice being built up that is like something close to harmony. And there is a kind of esoteric foreshadowing of the idea of as above, so below, presented in this book. Now, different people take this to different degrees of literalness. It doesn't seem to me that Plato actually thinks a city is like a person. You know, he doesn't actually think as above. So he's saying, let's imagine a city is like a person for the sake of, you know, building a metaphor to understand things. But there is this idea that the things like there's an internal harmony of the soul that he's trying to work towards. And the reason that he says that the tyrants are the unhappiest of men to be pitied is because their desire to tyrannize over others is a symptom of imbalance and conflict within themselves. And like, again, as foreshadowed with the conversation with Cephalus, maybe this mad master of sexual desire, or the lust for power, as it is sometimes called, is a symptom of injustice in the soul. It's not quite the same as Aristotelian virtue ethics, but it seems to be a kind of foreshadowing of, like, the virtuous man will know the moral action, except you know, Plato is saying, no, the just man is. Now, Aristotle says, you know, virtue is about being excellent in a lot of different things and having experience and being excellent. Whereas Plato says it's more to do with having this internal harmony within your own drives, within your own sub-personalities, that your logos and your thumos and your, I forget the Greek word for desires and appetites, but your basically your spirit, your head, and your stomach are aligned and working together as a chariot and not pulling in different directions or crashing into each other.
Right.
And that the man who seeks to be a tyrant and to take from others and do all these other things is a symptom of disquiet in your soul.
Yeah. I don't know if I always believe that either, but sometimes that's,
yeah.
In many cases, that's probably true. There, you know, like a lot of people, like I said, a lot of people who are very successful in whatever way, that could be a good success or bad success, are damaged in some way. and they're
David
like
Goggins
reacting to something. But yes,
David Goggins.
but
Mine.
yes. But at the same time, so like so like. Are we all a little damaged? Like it's something. Is that just kind of like this kind of excuse to like again resettlement like oh they're damaged, so that's why they're like that. Well, you're damaged and poor, and they're damaged and rich. So like but anyway, one of the things I wanted to bring up, like where we're at time wise. Okay, cool. One of the things that came to mind for me because I thought about this and part of our project in doing these podcasts is like, well, how do we feel about this? Like I don't care what Plato said about it as much as like, well, where are we at with it? Like, what are our answers to these problems? And I think when I took some of my self-defense classes, some handgun classes with Greg Hamilton in Seattle. You have all the legal parts of it they go through, and part of the legal parts, which is very important, and people who don't understand that are retarded. But the legal part of when you're allowed to shoot somebody by the law, and one of the phrases that kept coming up in that discussion, the class was like the idea of a reasonable person.
Yes.
And basically, it's like, would a reasonable person fear for his life in this situation, or something like this discussion of who is a reasonable person, and that is an interesting qualification. Like, what does it mean to be a reasonable person? And we can be nerdy about it and say how ridiculous that is, but also we kind of know.
We do.
Like that's like who's reasonable and who's not reasonable, and who's being who's making a moderate, like intelligent, like, okay, I can see both sides. All right, this is what was going on here. I've lived life and I'm realistic and I understand how things work in the world, and that's a lot of people are pretty reasonable as far as like that. But not necessarily online. But like in their real lives are going to be fairly reasonable. Like, is that what most people would experience and judge it? Like, would they have that same experience and feel that way? Because we're humans. We're human animals. Like, what within the context of our society, what would our expectations be?
Right.
And so it's like, so what I came up with in terms of justice in the legal sense, I don't like it as a word for all the other stuff that's going on as far as integrity and so forth, like the way of living and whatever. I think that's just an impossibly broad overlap. Okay, it's a thing that overlaps too many things.
Yes.
But too many parts of life. But I came up with like the ability to develop or negotiate solutions that satisfy reasonable people. Like if you and using that qualification of reasonable people, because you can't satisfy everybody. And in people who are like in the same way of like you have the knife of your friend, he's obviously crazy, whatever. You don't try to satisfy him because he's not reasonable. He's out of his mind. But for two guys who are sober and are of a certain age and are generally well respected as being decent, reasonable guys who like, okay, like these are two parties that are suing each other. Like there's a conflict there.
Yeah.
The person who's able to be the most just as far as who should dispense justice or whatever, if you're going to have that magical third person creating justice, is the person who can negotiate between those reasonable parties and be like, here's a solution that satisfies everybody and will also kind of satisfy the public. Like, generally speaking, that would be considered reasonable. And an anecdote that I can bring up, and you have a lot of smiles, so I feel like I've made an argument that somebody else made in fucking the Republic already, but that you're going to get into. But one of the things I was watching, we always watch these true crime things at night, right? We always have. And it's just the only thing we could agree on because everything else is just garbage. So we just watch murder stories about white trash, basically. And so we're watching this thing. It was like a Netflix thing of like, I killed my father. And basically the story was, as the story started, was, there's a murder scene. This kid who was in a pretty well-to-do neighborhood, a pretty well-to-do house, had killed his father, had shot his father. And obviously they're going to throw the book at him and like whatever. And then someone started looking into it. They're like, they found out that his father had abducted him at age 5 and cut him off from his mother. And he was homeschooled, but the homeschooling was really just not schooling. And he was just kept out of public view and just controlled. And he finally went to get his son a job. Basically, he's a teenager. And his son was like socially kind of like awkward and whatever. And the guy was also drank a lot and was known for abusing people all around, like the other people, like family that he was involved with and whatever. So that it becomes like a very different situation that involves judgment and not, just throw this kid killed his dad. Fuck you. Which is the first thing that you're going to do. But then it's like, this guy was a horrible monster who's like kept his kid like basically locked up for his whole life.
Yeah.
And had, I guess he had lost his job. His father had just lost his job and was that downward spiraling hard. And
would
like
you say it's
every day.
Would you say it's comparable to a man killing his own mother, perhaps?
Oh, I see what you did there. Yes, as in Orestes. Right. Yeah. So, but it was cool to see this play out because there was this like this district attorney who seemed like kind of a bitch at the beginning of the story. Like she was like, no. And this attorney that was like kind of from a bad family, he took the case pro bono and did all this stuff. And actually he got the district attorney to come around on the thing and make a reasonable, like, yes, this kid killed his father. And if he's convicted of that, we put it through trial and he's convicted, he goes to jail for the rest of his life. Like that's what happens with that charge. And then because of the circumstances, the DA and this guy actually worked together, the attorney worked together and came out to the point where he had like a manslaughter probation. And they had the kid in therapy and going to school and like trying to, become a normal member of society and reunited with his mother that he had been separated from at 5 because he, whatever. So it was actually kind of a cool story of like, I just generally assume that all judges at this point are evil, but it came to a discussion of like, well, this is actually, that was justice. Like it was not necessarily the law, how the way the law would have worked out. They made it legal, but it was reasonable people coming to a reasonable understanding about, hey, this is a weird situation.
They're not etymologically related, but it is. I love that our justice at least has the first 2 letters of judge, but judges are those with judgment. At the end of the day, or at least they're supposed to be.
Right.
And deciding the exceptions. And that's what juries are for too. They're not just to dispense the law. If it was just dispensing the law, we would just follow the law like an algorithm. But we don't because of cases like Orestes, or this young man here. I was chuckling before about the reasonable man thing because there is a sense in which this entire first book is, who is the reasonable man? Is it Socrates or is it Thrasymachus? You can make a very strong case that Thrasymachus actually is the more like realistic view. He's the political realist. He's the Machiavelli of his time. Whereas Socrates is rational, but it's a different idea it's a different notion of reasonability. And it reminded me, I hope I'm not sounding too pretentious in reading a bit of my own essay, but I had this in Descending Odin's Throne about Plato and the reasonable man standard. I said, Plato is notorious for advancing all varieties of arguments, many of which contradict each other and without any clear indication of which Plato himself holds. Nevertheless, the ideal of he with good intentions, which comes from Aeschylus in the Oresteia, as the just man, was certainly a view held by many of his day, including his instructor Socrates. Such was Socrates' respect for the state and the authorities and his fellow citizens, that he did not resist their persecution, nor did he even flee death when presented with the opportunity. His compulsion to philosophize, even at the cost of his own life, was built upon the conviction that his efforts were a service to the city. According to this view, if Socrates is wiser or more reasonable than others, it is not necessarily by virtue of his intellect, but rather by his good and peaceful intentions. He rejects malice and vengeance, even against enemies like Meletus, his primary accuser. And when Socrates is elevated as the patron saint of modern rationalism and the highest moral ideal of the scientist and the patriotic citizen, he simultaneously becomes the standard of rationality and reason itself. To be just is to be reasonable, which is why even to this day the reasonable person standard carries such weight in court and in the minds of the public when judging the moral culpability of a fellow citizen in a dispute. The standard is in fact definitional. The reasonable man is a just man, and the just man is a reasonable man. And of course, to be just requires having good intentions. So, the point of reasonability and who is the reasonable man is a funny thing to emphasize, because it is in fact the first question that Socrates asks of Cephalus. He says, but what if I run into an unreasonable man? Should I still return debts to him if that debt might harm him? Should we not disarm the unreasonable men? Which is a very politically, relevant subject in certain areas.
Right. Yeah, and I think that you can be. I mean, what I hate about Socrates is because he's being kind of silly about it. But that is that's a discussion, but not always. Do you just not pay your debts because you say somebody's unreasonable? No,
right.
No. But if they're asking for something that's not actually owed to them, then yeah, they're unreasonable. And other people would agree that that's not reasonable, or
right.
Or they already have you in the fine print, like they did something unreasonable, but you didn't catch it, and so you're stuck with it, and that's how it works. There's a lot of that in life. You don't read the fine print, and then you're like, oh, shit. Yeah, like, oh, I actually agreed to be in this contract for a year, and this service sucks.
Right.
But there's nothing I can do about it. So there's, it's unreasonable,
but it's funny because there have been a number of cases where someone signed a contract, and then got out of it because it was ruled that a reasonable person would not read a 30-page contract in all the fine print.
Right.
So, this reasonable person standard works in a few different directions.
Oh, for sure.
With good
judgment. It's a hard, you can't pin it down, but like I mean, this is the worst answer it's the worst best answer for a lot of things in the way that it doesn't really give you anything to work with. But in the way that you know when you see it,
wasn't that Benjamin Franklin's or Winston Churchill's answer to someone who's asking about democracy or a republic? It's the worst system except for all the other ones.
Right. Yeah, and the worst, to say we all know what it is, but to be unable to define it precisely, is terrible. But also human.
What's
also,
porn and what's art?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and we can. That one's even a little easier to drill down on. But
there's not multiple senses of porn. There's one kind. There's only one kind. Whereas justice can refer to actually 3 or 5 different things, maybe, or more.
Yeah. So I mean, I think in a sense, I wrote the Way of Men in response to the. I don't have to define masculinity because I know what it is when I see it. It is what most people say. Everybody knows, we have a sense of what it is. but then to drill down on what it is a little bit further, because unfortunately, if you don't define it, then other people will.
It's still valuable, even though you have that sense. It's still valuable to do the work. It's still valuable to descend down into the words and into the argument and to have that conversation. And you're like, well, what about this and what about that? Speaking of the Way of Men, Daniel Levy says, going to have to reread Way of Men. Book was ahead of its time. Thank you for your work, Jack.
You're welcome. And yes, it was.
And he also says, how about the guy that unalived the PDF file that was committing crimes against his son? He walked free. That's a reasonable man for me. Yes. I forget.
Yeah.
I feel like on live TV. That was fantastic.
If you ask most men, it doesn't, with the law that Athena set up, it doesn't fucking work. But if you ask most men if that was reasonable, they would say yes.
Well, not to defend Athena too hard, but what Athena set up was a jury. So ideally, if what most
it would be a jury of reasonable men.
If you got a jury of your peers. Now the problem is, if you, depending on how the institution of the law is set up locally, you might not get a jury of your peers. You might not get a representation of reasonability as defined by what is common. So, but in principle, I'm pretty sure there have been cases, especially in Texas, where someone unalives someone, and the jury says, "Oh yeah, that's a clear case of second-degree murder and 6 months probation," or There was a case actually in my hometown in Issaquah, Washington. I don't live there anymore, but there was a group of Marines that were doing some Toys for Tots drive in front of a Home Depot or something, and they were in front of an electronics store next to the Home Depot. That's right. And some shoplifter went into the electronics store, stole a bunch of stuff, came out. The Marines who were just standing there doing this Toys for Tots tried to stop him, and he stabbed one of them in the back. And after he stabbed them, he ran, but he tripped. He tripped on the curb. And so he tripped on the curb and had a fractured skull, several broken ribs, a broken arm, and internal bleeding from just tripping. And I don't think it was ever investigated further. So, just some people fall hard. And no reasonable person is like, this seems fishy to me. I don't think people get injured falling off curbs that way.
Yeah.
It's a judgment call.
He fell down. Yeah, for sure. It's nice to think that you get reasonable. Obviously, I would have no thought of getting a reasonable jury in America, because I feel like it's all retirees, retards, and government employees who can take an infinite amount of time off work, but because they're make work jobs. But in the ideal, would I like to be judged by I feel like I have a chance by 10 guys who would go to my jiu-jitsu gym. All right. That seems fair. We have similar values, whatever. It's all right, but so it's, who knows, but
but it's cool. And I think it can feel very tedious to work through a book like this, but it's so full of pertinent questions to our current situation today. You see a lot of the history of where these things come from, and it gives you the arguments. None of the arguments you're hearing about these subjects today are particularly new. Even you'll see an argument like red flag laws. That's just what Socrates is saying about, well, shouldn't we not give weapons to people who are not in their right mind? And then it's a question of, well, who is in their right mind? Which is a big philosophical discussion of the 20th century. What is sanity?
In that case, in this particular case, it's determined by a female psychologist who's a pacifist and a Democrat.
Right.
So therefore, Yeah.
Yeah. Although the science things cuts a couple different ways with female Democrats, because that mental health is not usually their strong point by the data. So
I didn't say it. But no, but just generally that's who psychologists are. But anyway, what else do we have? Any other questions?
We have one more question from Alexander Paulson. Do tribal ethics that scale and outcompete other tribes align closer with the capital T truth? Can there ever be a universal tribe? Are systems like Plato's Republic, Magna Carta, Constitution, lesser cosmic orders? Well, there's a whole discussion that we will hopefully have over the coming weeks about whether Plato's Republic truly is a universal tribe or system of that kind or not. The Magna Carta was a profoundly English system built on English laws for Englishmen who share the English, Robin Hood myth and self-conception and all that. But capital T truth is an interesting one. It's a subject Plato has a lot of opinions on elsewhere, and I have opinions on elsewhere. But Jack, what do you think?
Well, I mean, our basic frame is that we've already kind of said objective truth is bullshit. And actually, our friend Josh Tyler, who coerced me into using Marco Polo, and I still have 3 messages to listen to him. But we were talking about capital T truth a little bit, and he tends to be like, he made a good point that everything is like a model.
Yes.
Did
he say a line about there is objective truth, but there's no objective knowledge?
No, he didn't say that.
Okay.
That's just a different discussion you guys are having. But he said everything's a model, and he made a great example of a model being like, say they made a map of your backyard. Well, if it was a perfect map with all the details, you couldn't carry it around because it would be as big as your backyard.
Right.
And so everything smaller than that is a model, and it actually doesn't contain all the levels of detail. And so then then it's becomes increasingly less useful for certain things.
Right. And
I laughed about it because I said, and Lucio moves shit around back there like every single day, so it would immediately be out of date. I thought that was a good way to talk about the capital T truth, is that like it's basically a model, and so it's never going to be 100%. When we talk about like human orders, when we talk about civil, like global orders, well, I think we already know what my opinions about that are. They don't really work out because they're not at human scale, and human scale is very small in terms of how long or how well that society is going to survive. And the bigger system you get this centralized thing that makes decisions for places that say barely has a map for. Right. and barely doesn't understand or it doesn't care about. And so you just have, I think it just becomes really unworkable as the thing gets bigger and bigger and bigger. So I've always been a fan of smaller systems that are more localized and like closer to the people who are actually making the decisions. And in the way that we have politicians in Washington who never go home to their places, but they're supposed to represent people, but they really just work at Washington. Right. It would be better if the decisions were made by people that were closer to you, so they have to live with you. And the idea was the original idea of having these representatives, is that they don't get to work, they don't get to do that forever, and they have to come home and deal with all the people that they just fucked over. Right. So like that's the check and balance there that's kind of been lost over the time.
Representation is a funny theme in the subject of Plato, because we're going to hear in later books he has very critical things to say about representations and images of things. One of his critiques of poetry, or Socrates' critiques of poetry, is that they're just images of the thing, they're not the real thing. But it's set within the context of a city that they've built. And if I could give a little teaser about book 2, which we'll be going over next week, the entire premise of the city is built out of this notion of modeling. How do you model justice if it's hard to identify what justice is in a single individual? Maybe it would be easier to see justice if we had a larger image, like someone who is trying to identify something from far away, but if we made the letters much larger, then we would have an easier time reading it. So suppose we built a city and we would see what justice is like within a city, then we would know what justice is like in a man. And so we're going to, within this city, we're going to criticize representations, but we're going to build a representation of a man in the form of a city in order to get there. So, which is why it's important to occasionally come back to book 1 and remember the forms of these arguments that we're working through, and this playful tone, and remember, no Karl Popper, no Jonathan Rauch, no, he's not advocating this communist fascist totalitarian society, which we will eventually arrive at. We're doing a representation and an exploration of a thing, which is, as with the way of men, as with all kinds of valuable subjects, it's perhaps worth doing, and perhaps more enjoyable and more personally edifying to do than pursuing power.
Perhaps we wouldn't know because I'm not pursuing
yes.
it. I don't know how it feels because I'm not pursuing it. So like it might feel good. I like it's just not really in me to do that. But anyway, anyway, guys, I guess we'll probably wrap up here. But thank you for watching, and I think probably the next month here, it just takes me a while to get set up to do it because I want to have some things in place before we do it. But in the next month or so here, we're probably going to open up Order of Fire membership. So any of you who are listening or watching, I mean, Order of Fire is a big thing. We've kind of made it into a bigger thing because it's such a good idea. But what I'm talking about, the organization, the First Men, and that's kind of our membership organization, and that's really what supports us doing this. That's what supports this podcast is our memberships to the First Men, and then also obviously we have discussions in there, and then groups within groups in there that are happening, and the more people that join, the cooler it's going to be. Obviously events, and this is our inside crew and the people who are really in it with us and really developing solar idealism and building this out. And that's like, for instance, one of the things I'm very excited about I did today is that we had a poetry writing competition within the Order of Fire in the past for the past month. And we got, I think, 8 or 9 really, really good poems. Like, you guys worked pretty hard on them. Yours was so good, Chris, that I almost asked you. I'm like, are you trolling me? Did you have ChatGPT write that for you?
No, ChatGPT can't write poetry.
I'm like, this seemed like it's perfect. Like it came out of a book. Like I was kind of impressed with it. It seemed like something that someone already would have written. I almost thought you were fucking with me.
I did half steal part of one of the lines from Omar Khayyam.
Yeah,
an Iranian poet.
Yeah,
but anyways, yeah.
No, that's cool. Like I after reading it, I just got a sense while I was reading. I'm like, this is quite good. I don't know why. Is he fucking with me? Because it's hard for me to judge. Like I'm not going to vote in a composition because it's hard for me to judge poetry, and also I don't want to play the Athena role of like tie breaking because actually it's like a 3-way tie right now. But anyway, that is one of the things that we've gotten given out prize money within the order to the guys, and we're going to keep doing stuff like that.
And for myself, I'm excited that for Ed is going to be taking, like, you and I are taking people through on the outside through the Republic, but Ed is taking us all on the inside through this frickin' brick of the Ramayana, which is going to be
you're reading the brick version.
Well, yeah.
But we're reading, ours is only like 800 pages or something like that. But
only
I'm really excited about that. Yeah, we're exploring the Ramayana, and I'll probably be quoting that as time goes on. I haven't started it yet because I had this work to do I'm like, I had to get up to speed on Plato like today and yesterday. And so then the next thing, I need to spend a little bit of time with the Ramayana, but because it's 100 pages or whatever we have to get through for Sunday. But so that's some of the stuff that we do in the Order of Fire. So in the first men,
as well as
just keep
lifting
in mind
and archery and shooting and poetry and.
Well, oh yeah, we have a really active firearms group. That's one of the bigger talking groups we have too. But
good stuff.
But yeah, so keep that in mind to see if you'd like to apply next time we open it up. We'll let everybody know when that happens. But anyway, that's one of the ways you can support the Order of Fire and what we're doing here through the show. Other ways are buying some of the merch that we have. There's a store on a tab there. The new Pater book, if you haven't bought that yet, that's cool. Obviously, you've been referencing through the podcast. And and also there's a Patreon group. I've just made it the Order of Fire Patreon group because it used to be my personal one. But everything I'm doing now really is about the Order of Fire. So I'm just like, I don't do anything to the Patreon group, but it's a way that if maybe you can't afford to join the First Men, or you just want to throw a little bit of money our way, that's a way to do it.
Which is like what patrons used to do with arts back in the medieval ages.
Right. Well, I mean, didn't Thrasymachus ask to get paid to tell?
Yes.
Yes, he asked to get paid.
So you expect me to explain this to you and to give you an answer without payment? What is it? A nice notion. It's like that's very simple and naive of you. Like that sounds like something someone who believes in justice would think. Yeah.
Yes. But yeah, I mean, that's just we all need to eat. And be able to do cool stuff. So, but anyway, so thanks for watching, and I'm glad so many people tuned in. We had a good number in throughout the show. Turned out to be really good. I was a little worried it might get too dry, but in fact, quite the opposite. I think it's probably one of the better shows so far. So, yeah. But anyway, like, subscribe, and until next time, stay solar.
Stay solar.